Hi, in this short video, part of my series of short conversations to help with English listening, I'm going to talk about being an expatriate, an expat. Now, I'm English, but I live in Spain. That makes me an expat. Expatriate means somebody who lives abroad, lives in a different country to where they're born. It's interesting because I'm not sure if Spanish people living in other countries consider themselves to be expatriates. It seems to me that expat is a typically English or British thing. And there are some characteristics of your typical expat in Spain, which I think are interesting and worth talking about. You probably all know plenty of expats, and they're certainly well recognized as a feature of Spanish life. Many live on the costas, for example, and they might live in communities of expats because one thing about a certain kind of English expat is that they have a certain sense of longing for the things that they left behind in Blighty. Now, blighty is a word that only an expat would use to refer to their homeland, to England. Blighty. Now, don't even know where the word comes from. Now, the typical things that people have a yearning for, the morriña, as you call it in Spain, it is for food, paradoxically. Food. Even though people will say, oh, I love Spanish food, I love paella, they will also have a yearning for good old fish and chips, or mushy peas, or brown sauce like HP sauce. If you haven't tried it, you can probably get it at the Corte Inglés. Personally, I don't like it. Uh, they also might complain about not being able to get the beer that they like at their old pub. If you want to know more about that, look at my video on beer. It's peculiar that people uh, have this longing for food back in England because one of the things that they say about Spain is you can't get a good curry in Spain. I'm sure it's not true, but it's certainly the case that English people have become accustomed to Indian food. Um, Now, expats in the costas or on the costas in Spain, like I said, they might live in communities or live fairly close to one another. They often do business with one another. They might set up businesses in Murcia, for example, as gardeners, um, or or if they're retired, they might have retired from their job and bought themselves a small apartment and spend time walking along the beach and patronizing their local pub. Pub culture is another thing that people from Britain would miss. In a typical expat bar on the Costas, the typical expat is much more patriotic than people living in the UK itself. So they typically have a photograph of the Queen, or I suppose the King now, and Union Jacks everywhere. So this was rather peculiar in the time of Brexit, when Brexit was turning over. You would have thought that expats living in Spain would be opposed to Brexit because it wasn't in their interest. But in fact, many of them were very much anti-European Union and pro-Brexit. So they tend to be royalists. They tend to have a sentimental attachment to the good old BBC, and perhaps they tune into the BBC World Service, which is an old fashioned way of listening to the radio, dating back to the Cold War when Britain had a world presence and the BBC had World Service programs from around the globe. Of course, now we all have mobile phones and we can listen to any radio that we like from anywhere in the world. But in the old days, the World Service was a big thing. It's fading now. It's fading now, a little bit like the British Council. Now, I teach English and I really value the British Council Learn English website. It's got some very good materials that I'm quite happy to use. But the British Council is a good example of the way expats see themselves. You want a vision of how British people want to present themselves to the world. Look into your local British Council office and see what they have going on, because they like to promote UK culture. They like to promote British artists, British music, British culture. And of course, as I mentioned in my piece on multiculturalism, current British culture is definitely multicultural. And you'll certainly see that, you'll certainly notice that on the Learn English website, where many of the names are not your typical Peter, John, and David. You'll see Hakim and Abdullah and other names from around the world. So it's not frozen vision of an old-fashioned Britain. The British Council is trying to keep up to date with current Britain. Now, having said that, I'm getting old. I'm 60 years old, and perhaps I'm out of date. But it's certainly true that when I get together with other expatriate British people, um, there is a certain kind of conversation that you always have. And at the risk of offending you, I'm going to tell you the kinds of things that British people tend to say, or expats tend to say, when they get together. So, the first thing that they always say is, have you seen the way that people drive? Okay, so criticizing driving in another country, and particularly in Spain, is just so common. Every single person, every single expat I have ever met criticizes Spanish drivers. This is rather funny because when I speak to Spanish people, they think they're the best drivers in the planet. Whereas if you talk to an expat, well, if I talk to an expat, perhaps not if you talk to an expat, because if you talk to an expat, they'll probably be polite. But when they get together, they have this tendency to criticize. So they say Spanish drivers drive too fast and too close. That is the standard critique. The other aspect of Spanish society that British expats typically criticize is bureaucracy. Everybody has a story about trying to go about some kind of business with the administration. It might be the tax office, it might be extranjería, it might be trying to get some papers filled out for a building permit, and everybody has a story about how absurd the regulations and the implementation of the regulations are in Spain. So bureaucracy is for expats is a defining feature of Spanish life. Um, I think they're probably forgetting quite how bad the bureaucracy is at home. But anyway, there you go. When people are abroad, they like to criticize the natives. And this really is offensive. But uh, a lot of expats really do have a kind of colonial hangover. They seem to still think that they are the colonial masters voyaging abroad amongst the natives. So, sorry to tell you, but you look at them as Giris and they look at you as natives. You're slightly less civilized, perhaps, and you can be dealt with some degree of condescension because you haven't developed in your society to the same beautiful level as British democracy. Of course, this is all laughable, but I have to say it's entered into conversations I've had with expats in the past. Um, the last thing, meal times. Meal times have a profound effect on all aspects of the way that expats relate to Spanish people. This is the story. The story is that Brits get up early, they go straight to work, they have a break at 11, which is called 11s, for a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and then they have lunch at 1 o'clock, maybe even 12:30 to 1, and that's a light lunch. Maybe it's a sandwich or a salad. And then they have their dinner at 6 o'clock, between 6 and 7. That's the dinner is the major meal of the day. And then perhaps later on they have supper. And supper would just be something light with a drink before going to bed. When they come to Spain, they're horrified by the fact that people get up, have a cup of coffee and a biscuit, which is 11s as breakfast, and then they go off to work and maybe they disappear mid-morning and go and have breakfast in a bar. And when the English person is having lunch 12:30 to 1, the Spanish worker is just returning from his break and is going to continue working until 3. Um, Meanwhile, the English worker will have returned to work, might even have worked through lunch. People work on a computer, they just have a sandwich and keep working. And the English worker will finish. It's in England, it's called the 9 to 5. You finish work at 5, whereas Spanish people work much more into the evening. And then they go for a walk, which is peculiar again from a British point of view. The paseo, going and having something on the street with everybody on the street. It's not a part of British culture. And having dinner late at between 9 and 10 o'clock. I can even hear from here the tut, tut, tut of the expats saying, but that cannot be healthy. And even worse is that children are up at 10 o'clock at night. Don't they have a bedtime? The expat says. Now, this is all very amusing, these differences, but they do create some areas of tension when you meet an expat. So be patient with expats. They really don't understand Spanish way of life. They like it, they like to observe it, but they're all yearning for Blighty, really. So anyway, that's all of this that I've said today is one of the reasons that I avoid hanging out with expats if I possibly can. Okay, I hope this has been of some use to you. I hope there are some words and expressions here that are helpful to you. Leave a comment if you find it useful.